What if I told you that an 18-year-old man and his fiancée believed they were fighting demons inside a baby's body, and that their so-called battle with evil turned into one of the most disturbing cases Texas has ever seen? Imagine a child, just 13 months old, subjected to hours of unimaginable suffering, all under the twisted justification of an exorcism. The case shocked even the most seasoned investigators, leaving them grasping for answers to a crime so cruel it almost defied human comprehension. And years later, in September 2025, after more than a decade of appeals, mental health battles, and fierce debates over junk science in courtrooms, that man, Blaine Milam, was strapped to a gurney in Huntsville, Texas, to face his final reckoning. But the story of how it all began and how it ended is darker and more complex than you might think. Welcome to Death Row Diaries. Make sure you hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story. Now let's dive into the case of Blaine Milam. Blaine Milam was born on December 12, 1989, in Gregg County, Texas. By most accounts, his early life wasn't marked by fame or notoriety. He grew up in a working-class environment, lived the kind of small-town life most people in East Texas would recognize: school, family, friends, and the normal routines of adolescence. But Blaine's teenage years were different. Trouble seemed to shadow him. He bounced in and out of responsibility, searching for identity and purpose like many young men on the edge of adulthood. What set Blaine apart was not a record of extreme violence or criminal genius, but rather his vulnerability to influence. He was impressionable, easily swept up in other people's beliefs and emotions. By the time he was 18, Blaine had met Amora Carson. She was only a teenager herself, but their relationship grew intense quickly. Soon they were engaged. The couple moved into a trailer in Rusk County, Texas. To the outside world, they were just two young people trying to start a life together. But behind closed doors, something far more sinister was brewing. On December 2, 2008, a frantic call rang through to police in Rusk County. Blaine Milam was on the line, reporting that his fiancée's 13-month-old daughter, Amora Carson, was dead. When officers arrived at the scene, what they found was far from a simple case of sudden tragedy. Inside the trailer, the air was thick with confusion, chaos, and horror. Little Amora's body bore injuries so severe, investigators were left shaken to their core. At first, Blaine and Jessica told police they had simply left Amora alone for about an hour, only to return and discover her lifeless. It was a claim that might have bought them time, but cracks began to form in their story almost immediately. Within hours, their account shifted. This wasn't just a tragic accident, they claimed. No, this was something much darker. According to Blaine and Jessica, Amora had been possessed by demons. They insisted that what happened inside that trailer wasn't murder. It was an exorcism. But as the investigation unfolded, the exorcism defense began to look less like a desperate act of faith and more like an unspeakable cover for torture. The autopsy told a story no parent or fiancé could explain away. Amora had suffered for hours. Her small body carried the evidence of a prolonged and brutal ordeal. Multiple skull fractures, broken arms and legs and ribs, countless bite marks by both Blaine and Jessica, severe trauma from blunt force, including strikes from a hammer. The forensic pathologist later testified that there were so many potentially fatal injuries that he couldn't even single out one definitive cause of death. Amora's suffering had been total. Prosecutors would argue that this wasn't an attempt to save the child from demons. It was sadistic violence masquerading as religious ritual. Forensic evidence suggested that the so-called exorcism lasted up to 30 hours, a slow and agonizing nightmare for a baby who never stood a chance. Even seasoned law enforcement officers found themselves shaken. Rusk County District Attorney Michael Jimerson would later describe it as almost impossible to process. It's very hard to confront the idea that someone would derive their gratification from the torture of a baby. That diminishes us all.
By 2010, Blaine Milam stood before a jury. Prosecutors painted him as a young man consumed by twisted beliefs and savage impulses. They argued that Blaine had driven the exorcism, convincing Jessica to join him in carrying out acts that defied any sense of humanity. The evidence was overwhelming. Bite mark comparisons, hammer injuries, and even testimony suggesting Blaine had confessed to a nurse after his arrest. But Blaine's defense team fought back. They claimed Jessica was the real instigator. According to Blaine, Jessica was delusional, plagued with visions and distortions that convinced her Amora was possessed. He argued that Jessica's instability, not his own hand, led to the child's death. Jessica, however, was tried separately. The jury found her guilty of capital murder, sentencing her to life in prison without parole. Blaine's fate, meanwhile, was sealed when his jury handed down the death penalty. At just 20 years old, Blaine Milam was the youngest man on Texas death row. This case is difficult to hear, but it's important to understand how justice works, and sometimes how it fails. If you're with us so far and want to see more of these deep dives into true crime and death row cases, make sure you like this video and subscribe. It really helps us grow this community of people seeking the truth behind the headlines. Now, Blaine's story didn't end in 2010. It dragged on for more than 15 years, filled with controversy, appeals, and shocking last-minute twists. From the moment his death sentence was handed down, Blaine's attorneys launched appeal after appeal. Their arguments centered on two controversial points. Bite mark evidence. By the mid-2010s, bite mark analysis had been widely discredited. In 2016, the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology labeled it unreliable. Blaine's lawyers argued that much of the case against him leaned on this junk science. Intellectual disability. Under U.S. law, executing someone who is intellectually disabled is unconstitutional. Blaine's team insisted he had developmental limitations that made him ineligible for the death penalty. In 2019 and again in 2021, Blaine came within days of execution, only for courts to issue stays. Each time he was pulled back from the brink. Each time the debate reignited. Was Blaine Milam truly guilty as charged, or was he a scapegoat for Jessica Carson's delusions? But the state of Texas pressed forward. Prosecutors countered that even without bite mark evidence, DNA and confessions tied Blaine to the crime. They argued that Blaine had tried to hide evidence and showed clear awareness of his actions, proof, they said, that he was not intellectually disabled. Appeal after appeal collapsed. By 2025, Blaine's final hope lay with the United States Supreme Court. In September 2025, Blaine Milam's lawyers made one last desperate attempt to Supreme Court. They petitioned the court to halt his execution, citing discredited forensic science and renewed claims of intellectual disability. But on September 25th, the Supreme Court denied the stay. The state of Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles had already rejected his request for clemency. The clock had run out. At the Huntsville unit, preparations began. Texas had already executed 4 inmates that year, with Blaine set to be the 5th. Across the country, executions were rising, with Florida leading the nation at a historic pace. For Blaine, this was the end of the road.
Hours before his execution, Blaine was offered his last meal. He chose a heavy Southern spread, a cheeseburger, oven-fried potatoes, green beans, pinto beans, sliced bread, scrambled eggs, country gravy, a sausage patty, pears, biscuits, tea, and water. It was the kind of meal you might expect at a family table in East Texas, but in Blaine's case, it was his final comfort. As he was strapped to the gurney, Blaine gave his final statement. Instead of defiance or denial, he offered gratitude. He thanked the Texas Department of Criminal Justice for allowing death row inmates access to the prison chaplaincy program. His words surprised many. For years he had fought against his conviction, yet in his last moments he turned not to protest, but to faith. At 6:23 p.m., Blaine Milam was declared dead by lethal injection. What do you think? Did Blaine Milam truly deserve the death penalty, or did flaws in forensic science and questions about his mental state cast enough doubt to spare his life? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective matters, and we want to hear from you. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next execution story we cover. Blaine's execution didn't end the debates. Forensic experts continue to warn against the use of bite mark evidence in courtrooms. Advocates for the intellectually disabled argue that Blaine's case represents a failure of justice. But for prosecutors, the outcome was simple. A baby had been tortured to death, and Blaine Milam was responsible. Even now, Rusk County's district attorney says the case lingers in his mind. The brutality, the inexplicable cruelty, the attempt to hide behind religion, it all left scars not only on the family of Amora Carson, but on the community as a whole. The case forces us to ask hard questions. How far should courts go to ensure evidence is solid? And what does justice look like when a crime is this horrific? The story of Blaine Keith Milam is a reminder that evil doesn't always come in the form of a hardened criminal with a long record. Sometimes it comes wrapped in the face of an ordinary young couple who convince themselves of extraordinary lives. Amora Carson was only 13 months old when her life was stolen in the most brutal way imaginable. And whether Blaine was deluded, manipulated, or fully aware of his actions, the state of Texas decided he would pay with his own life. If you found this case as chilling and thought-provoking as we did, please like this video, subscribe to Death Row Diaries, and share it with someone who follows true crime. We have more cases coming, some you've heard of, and others that will shock you for the very first time. Because on this channel, we don't just tell stories, we bring you face to face with the darkest corners of justice, where life and death hang in the balance.